Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we're talking with ex-BigLaw recruiter Sadie Jones about the upcoming virtual OCI process. Your Law School Toolbox host today is Alison Monahan, and typically I'm with Lee Burgess. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so that you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. We are the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we would love to hear from you. With that, let's get started. Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we're talking with ex-BigLaw recruiter Sadie Jones about the upcoming virtual OCI process. So welcome, Sadie.
Thanks for having me back.
My pleasure. Well, to kick things off, what's happening with OCI now? I mean, I know we already talked on a different podcast about it moving to the winter, but where are we in this process now?
So that happened. So most OCI was moved to early to mid-January. And then on top of that, pretty much everything I've heard is that it's going to be a virtual process, which I don't think was set. Yeah, as everything is these days. Right. I think over the summer, maybe there was the idea that it would still be in person just later. And now we sort of realize everything's going to be virtual. So that's kind of, the other difference from normal OCI.
Mm-hmm. And do you think this is still going to be that kind of compressed process where it happens in, say a few days at each school, or is this going to be more spread out? Do you have any sense of that?
I think it's going to be pretty much exactly the same as a regular OCI would be from what I've heard. Law firms are going to get the same kind of schedules that they would normally get. So let's say they sign up for a day or two of interviews, one after the other, let's say 20 a day. And I think everything, will be 1 to 2 weeks like it normally would be. And so students will have the same kind of schedule that they would have had anyway. The difference is they won't have to leave their house.
Right. Well, let's talk about that a little bit. I mean, it seems like there's some pros and cons to this. What do you think the students and or the firms are gaining or losing in this process if it goes virtual?
So I think there's actually a lot of benefits to it. I think one important thing is that firms have a lot of trouble getting interviewers to go to places. I know from personal experience. And so, sometimes you're not sending your top people, you're sending somebody who's willing to go. So I think they might have a better shot of getting, kind of like big shot partners to do it, or people, who they would really choose, who are willing to do it when they don't have to go anywhere, and take like multiple days out of their life and get on a plane and all that. So I think that's a big advantage. I think it's just kind of easier for firms to sort of schedule things. It's less expensive. All of that is a positive for a firm. I think on the student side, it can be kind of chaotic, like running around to different rooms and finding out where you need to go, and you're sweaty and you're trying to keep everything straight. And so I think there's something that may be easier about not having to move around a lot. So I think that's a positive. The obvious negative is that virtual interviews can be awkward, and especially if you're not really used to them. And I do think you lose out on something not seeing people face to face.
Right. No, I agree with all of that. I mean, I know when I was working as an associate, it was like such a nightmare for the hiring people to try to get people to fly to the East Coast. It's like, oh, well, you're an alum. Like, don't you want to go back to your school? It's like, I'm in the middle of trial. Like, I can't go do interviews for you. I'm sorry.
Exactly. And lots of like last minute changes too when that happens.
Yeah, I think people are just kind of stressed out by like trying to work and travel and do this and all that. So I agree with you. I think, ideally they would be able to get a better diversity of interviewers, and also just people who are, would do it voluntarily and not have to be roped into it if they don't actually have to fly across the country.
Definitely. I think the positives outweigh the negatives. I mean, even though we don't have a choice, but
right.
We're just kind of evaluating it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one thing that occurred to me, I know that they had at these hotel type situations or the schools, like hospitality suites. I know certain firms through parties. Do you think there's any way, I mean, are they trying to replicate this at all? And then how do you think people can maybe say you want to get an interview after you weren't given one initially? Like, is there any way to kind of reach out to people outside of just the formal interviews?
So my understanding is they are replicating this, and I think some of the, bigger schools are offering virtual hospitality suites. And I, was trying to figure out exactly how it worked. I mean, I think it's really just, a Zoom where people can join. And I think you can even do kind of like breakout rooms. And I know some people have already done things like this, and they said that it went okay, and that it's actually not really that different from an actual hospitality suite for whatever reason. Like, you're having the same kind of conversations. So I think that's an option. And I think firms will be doing virtual events in the same kind of way. So I think students should take advantage of any of those options, like find out about them, because I do wonder if less students will participate. And so that gives an advantage to students who do participate. And I would say along the same lines, if you don't get on a schedule and you're really interested for whatever reason, and there isn't like a virtual hospitality suite, and normally you go in person and try to make your case, I would definitely reach out ahead of time and send your stuff and express your interest, because I do think less students are going to do that or think about that. And so anyone who sort of takes the initiative, like as a recruiter, I always knew that the students who really reached out and wanted to be added on were serious and really interested. So I definitely think students should do that.
Right. I mean, I recall dropping by those hospitality suites just if I was thirsty or hungry or like needed a pen. So I definitely was, obviously I would chit chat with whoever was there, but I probably wasn't really that serious about giving them my materials.
Yeah. I mean, and you kind of, you lose that kind of aspect of it, and I think sometimes people randomly make connections that way or end up on a schedule they wouldn't have expected to be. So this has to be a little more sort of conscious and thought out. But that being said, I think you should cast a wide net. And so I think like any advantage you have to do more rather than less, I would do.
Right. Let's talk about that a little bit. I mean, do you think this is going to be a harder than average OCI season, whether it's because of the virtual format or moving or just the overall economic uncertainties we're in right now?
All of the above, yes. It will be harder. That being said, it's not sounding that like atypical yet. Firms are participating. They're going to have summer classes overall. I mean, I think there's no question they're going to be smaller probably.
Right.
And so it is going to be more competitive, and they are going to be, probably narrowing their focus in terms of, if they don't fill up their summer class, I doubt they're going to be like looking to top it off. I think they'll be fine with whoever they get. So I do think, it's going to be competitive, and, there's just going to be fewer jobs, no question. But I don't think that people should be so discouraged that they're not trying and they're not actively reaching out, because things are sort of happening in a way that they normally would.
Right. And how do you think students should really think about bidding in this environment? Do they need to be more cautious?
I think that they definitely need to be less picky. So I think you sort of have to be thinking like, I need to, like, I would bid for more than you might have before. And you maybe say like, okay, I'm not going to get, my top choices. I think potentially you should give more weight to the sort of middle or more like safety places than you do the sort of reach ones, where normally maybe that's what you would focus on, like, oh, maybe one of my reach ones will work out. I think I would take a different approach where I need to get something and I need it, earlier rather than later, and I would just be realistic.
Right. I agree. I mean, I don't think this is the time to be shooting for like the stars, even if you think maybe you could get one, throw a couple of those places in, but it's just like applying to law schools or college. You want to make sure you have a number of your kind of solid options and then some safety options if that's something that's even in the ballpark for you. to make sure that you do have something, because I think there's probably just going to be a little bit more variability too. Even someone who thinks, okay, I'm a really strong interviewer in person, maybe you're not such a strong interviewer on Zoom. You just don't really know.
Exactly. I think there's different challenges. And I think, some of the top firms, they may be tightening sort of their grade standards, and they may only be looking for a smaller percentage of the class. And that stuff you can't control, right? Like, your grades are what they are. We've talked about this before. So, if they're going to be more picky, then you need to be more realistic about places you think will be open to whatever your grades are. If they're, not the top 5%.
Yeah. And I also wonder, if people are bidding pretty soon, obviously firms aren't going to have those third semester grades. Do you think they may even wait to hire until they have those grades, even if they do the interviews earlier in January?
Yeah, my understanding is they are trying to coordinate the grades with when they're doing the OCI.
Okay.
So some of the schools even pushed out their OCI or are insisting that professors get grades back. They're due on a certain date. So I do think the schools are trying to figure that out. That being said, if it doesn't work out, I think it'd be similar to, if you were a 1L, you may get an interview and they may say that they need to see the grades, to make a final decision. So I think that can happen too. And I know some students who were upset that they had a pass-fail in the spring, took some classes over the summer. And I know some people were able to sort of get their GPAs a little bit up, I've heard. So just make sure that whatever you're doing, it's the most up to date and you're very clear in all your materials about what your grades are.
Right. And how concerned do you think people should be when they're thinking about bidding, if they maybe are reading something on the internet about how firms, say, cut their staff or maybe even cut associates, like in March when the pandemic really hit, and or what they did with last summer's programs for summer associates, because there was a pretty wide variation in what firms did. How concerned should people be about the past here?
I think that you should definitely do your research, and I think you should be somewhat concerned. But that being said, most firms did something, and so I think you should look more specifically at what they did. If they offered everybody from their last summer class, that's a bigger red flag to me than doing a 5% furlough, or there's other things that are smaller. Some of the partners weren't taking their draw for, the quarter, things like that. But I think actually actively getting rid of people, turning away a summer class, not having a summer class or not really announcing it, all those things are bigger red flags. Or if you hear actively, that whatever, their main practice group is something that's clearly not happening, that's a big issue.
Right. I think this is definitely a time to pay attention to that, because even as we've talked about on a previous podcast, in 2008, which frankly I think was much more dismal for the legal economy at law firms than this is, there were still some firms doing pretty well, but depending on what type of practice areas they had, some of them were not doing well at all.
Also, if you hear are they being transparent about it? I think that's another thing to think about. And that sort of happened in 2008. There were some firms that actually ended up closing that were actively hiring summers right before, even though there were a lot of rumors. So I do think that I would give some credence to rumors right now.
Yeah, I think you just have to sort of evaluate it. Let's be honest, firms will always use a situation like this to get rid of people, if they wanted to get rid of them anyway. So I don't think just the fact that, they got rid of a few people is necessarily a huge red flag. But I think you also, in terms of the summer program, some people continued paying people, some people didn't, some people gave offers, some people didn't, some people had a virtual program, some people didn't. You just kind of want to look at would I have been comfortable in this scenario, understanding that obviously people were making quick decisions based on whatever information they had. But I do think you can tell how people treat their employees, based on what they do. And do you want to be part of that?
Absolutely. And I think, like we said, there are things that are sort of bigger deals than other things. I do think that rescinding offers is something that is a huge red flag to me. That should be last resort. So if they're doing that.
Yeah. I would just wonder at that point why they're even doing OCI. If you just didn't, if you didn't give offers to your entire last summer class, because you didn't have a program, but now you're going out and hiring again. I'm like, what's going on here? Like, they don't seem that committed to this. Shouldn't they be committed to the people they already had?
Exactly. And usually you'll hear, people know, even around campus, even if you're not there physically, you'll hear if there's something going, like, very few of this is so hidden that no one has any idea. So basically, I would just do your research and sort of, be careful about, what's going on there. But overall, it seems like firms are weathering this okay. Like you said, I think 2008 was worse, at least so far in the legal market.
Yeah, I think definitely, at least at this point. So fingers crossed. What do you think about in-person callbacks? Do you think those are totally a thing of the past for now too? Have you heard anything on that?
I think they're a thing of the past. I think pretty much everything is going to be virtual. I guess there's a chance that if you were local, they might offer that as an option. But I think it's super unlikely. So everything you should prepare for should be virtual. And again, with the callbacks, I think that's easier too. I think that makes things way easier. Also, another thing to consider is that they kind of have less risk for having more callbacks because they're not paying to fly the person out and put them up in a hotel and their food and things like that. So there's a chance that they could say like, oh, maybe we'll interview more people and, we have more options.
Right. Yeah, and I think it's, easier for students too. I mean, I remember when I was interviewing as a 1L, I literally arrived back on campus after winter break and then got an email, I think that same day, of a California firm asking me to fly out and meet with them. So I had to turn around, 3 days later and get on a plane back to California. Like, I had work to do. I was trying to do all this stuff. And then, it was just crazy. So I think to the extent you can even avoid that, it's just going to be easier for students.
I totally agree. And I know some students like the free trip and some of the perks, but I think overall this is going to be a positive.
Yeah, I mean, that seems good in theory until you realize that you have like reading and class that you're missing and projects to do. And now you're stuck on a flight for 6 hours. It's like, it's a lot less fun when you're really doing it.
Exactly. And I think that, the advantage to virtual is sort of, like I said, you're not like running around and needing to get somewhere at a certain time. I think there's just some logistics that are easier.
Right. Yeah, because even doing interviews in New York, like being in New York, it was still this whole thing. It took half of your afternoon at least if you were just going to go and do like a 2-hour interview and you end up being there the whole day. So, it was a lot actually. I mean, just doing all that. Well, let's talk about the actual virtual interviews. And we've done some talking about this, so people can go listen to that podcast. But in general, give us the shortcut. What should students really be thinking about when you're getting ready for the virtual interview?
Well, some of it is the same. So you need to dress the same as you were going to dress, if you were seeing them in person. So that means suit and all the advice we gave before. And, I think the other things you have to think about are sort of your technology. So make sure that you've practiced, like you have no issue with Wi-Fi, that you have a good background, lighting, the height that the camera's at. You should be checking all of this ahead of time. You should do probably a practice session with somebody else. Also, different firms are going to use different kind of platforms for this, and so make sure that you have whatever prepared and it's downloaded and you know how to get in, all that stuff. So I think there's some things you just need to set up ahead of time. Also, another thing to remember is, they might send you a calendar invite or whatnot, but remember to think about time zones. Because I have noticed that people have issues with that, and especially, with it being virtual, like they very well may be in another time zone.
Yeah, I think you definitely want, anytime someone sends you a confirmation email, you just want to make sure that it has the actual time zone of the interview time in it. And if not, confirm, because they might send you something saying, all right, we'll see you at 3 p.m. and they're on the East Coast and you're on the West Coast and you're both thinking that's 3 p.m. your time. So, just always confirm, hey, just confirming that we are talking about 3 p.m. Eastern or 3 p.m. Pacific, because oftentimes the answer will be, oh, no, no, that's not what we're talking about.
And make sure you have it in an email that somebody has written it so that in case there's any problem, it's not going to come back to like, you just didn't show up.
Right, exactly. So I'm saying your final confirmation should always be confirming the actual time zone time, so that if there is that issue, you can point to it and say, oh, well, it says here 3 p.m. Eastern, so that's when I came to the Zoom link.
Exactly. So all of these kind of, some of it, this is easier, obviously, than in person, but you sort of have the added like technology, those kind of issues.
Right. I think on clothing, you want to think about, okay, is this going to look okay on a camera? There's certain things that just generally don't, like loud stripes and things, nothing too distracting. And I think, oftentimes people have concerns about, well, what if I don't have a really professional option? Sometimes, how do you feel about those fake backgrounds?
I think that's okay as long as it's not distracting. I mean, I wouldn't have like, the Eiffel Tower behind you or something. I think it should just be blank or something.
I just find them kind of distracting because they, particularly I think with hair, they don't really like get exactly. So sometimes you see like the little line around it. You definitely want to try that out.
Or sometimes I've seen if you move, like it'll like take your face away or something like that. So just be really careful with them because they can sort of do weird things. I mean, I kind of like either a blank wall or like a picture, and that might even be something to talk about in the interview.
Yeah, I feel like worst case scenario, you almost always have some type of blank-ish wall in your house that you can set up a little table in front of. So basically you have the table and then you have your chair and the laptop facing you, and then all of that's facing the wall. That's a really great setup if you don't have something, that looks like a professional library, which no one's really expecting because you're a law student.
And not in your bed.
No.
Be really careful. I can imagine somebody doing that.
Well, I mean, I think, sometimes you don't realize what the angle of the webcam is going to be depending on the program. Yeah. So, I mean, I've learned being on virtual panels and things, depending on the technology they're using, is getting a different angle. So sometimes I can set up like on one wall and everything's great. And then other times it's like getting half of my living room through a door. And you're like, oh, okay, that looks really different than the last time we did this. I don't want that on there. Yeah. So I think.
Or like any objects they can see, like anything that will be visible on the camera.
Right.
I would just be careful.
Yeah.
Also to be careful that like no one's going to walk into the room.
Right.
You sort of taking care of like noise and pets and children. That being said, like, things happen, and I think people get it now, and we've talked about this before. Like, I think overall people will be understanding, but I think it's on you to do everything you can to make sure that it's, quiet and you're focused and all of that.
Yeah, and I think if you are in a situation where you're working from home and in some sort of chaos situation, which is totally understandable, I think that's when you have to think about, like, can your school offer you a blank office that you can use for this? I'm sure that if you're near campus, they're probably going to be sympathetic, if you have kids and pets and partners at home and all this stuff going on, like, you probably need a different space.
Yeah, and I think it's just about communication. I'm sure they've thought about this and they're trying to help and do what they can. So it's just about, being open.
Yeah, it's in the school's interest to help you get this job. So
for sure.
Don't be afraid to ask. Like, hey, I really need an office for a couple of hours. Like, can you make that happen? I think someone will make that happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, before we wrap up, let's just kind of circle back a little bit. Do you think firms have changed in terms of what they're looking for at all, given the situation? I mean, you mentioned maybe they're going to be more open to interviewing more people. I mean, maybe they're going to want better grades. I mean, maybe they want, I can think of any number of things maybe they want now. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, and I could think of it going like a few different directions. Like, I could think of firms wanting people who are really flexible on one hand, right?
Right.
And are willing to fit into whatever practice group, has business at the time or switching or whatever it is. So I see that as a positive. I can also see, and I've heard of situations where they're trying to really slot people into an exact spot because they're trying to say, like, this is our need. And so, I'd be careful in that situation. Like, don't say yes I wouldn't even bother interviewing for something you know is never going to be a fit if it's really specific. But I also don't think it's a time to be picky. So if it's something that maybe wouldn't have been your first choice, but you think like, oh, maybe I could do that. Like, this isn't the job you'll have forever. And so, I think just generally being flexible is a good idea and making sure that that's coming across to the firm. So I think that firms probably are trying to figure out like what their needs are and what makes the most sense for summer associates. So I think that, like I said, there kind of could be this mix between wanting people who are really like generalists and then also wanting people that fill specific spots. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I think that firms realize that they are probably really going to have their pick of people. And so I think, you're really going to have to put your best foot forward and make sure that you're just giving them, the best documents, that you have your story straight, that you're being really professional. I mean, I think you just have to think like the standards are really high right now. And, it's not a time to be picky. It's not a time to ask for things. I think we were just talking about splitting a summer, which is something I don't suggest anyway, but like now would be a time not to even go there with anyone, I don't think. I would just kind of like nail down whatever thing you can as soon as possible, even if it's not your first choice. Like I would just go into it saying like, I need to find a job next summer.
No, I completely agree with that. I don't think this is the time to be picky. I don't think this is the time to be demanding. I don't think this is the time to hold out for like that dream firm that you think you have a 10% shot at getting when you have an offer from a perfectly good firm that you would be happy working at. I mean, take that offer. Yeah. Don't be silly about this. Your world will not end if you have a slightly less prestigious offer at a law firm that's perfectly fine. That is way better than ending up with nothing at the end. So, I think some of this comes down to bidding and interviewing and, being realistic. But, if there are places that you're like dead set on working, then try to get those scheduled first if you can for callbacks and all that kind of thing. But like you said, the firms are playing that same game. They realize people are, I don't want to say desperate, but, more incentivized to take an offer. So they're probably also going to be trying to go after the people that they really want to go after them faster.
I also think that the firms are going to be probably more picky about grades and, that set stuff. But on the other hand, I think they're looking for people who are going to be willing to be a team player and make things work and do what they need right now. And so I think they also will pass people by, even who are top people who they think are going to be a pain.
Oh, yeah.
Because they realize that they have a lot of options. And so I don't think now is going to be a time where a firm's like, oh, well, they're number one in their class, so we have to take them. And they, don't do well in the interview or just seem like a problem. So I think just, that stuff will matter too, sort of like the personality and soft skills.
I definitely agree. I don't think anyone has the capacity right now to be dealing with a person who's a pain, don't be that person. And the other
thing I'd add in is I would make sure that you get across to whoever you're talking to kind of how you've navigated this time. Like, I don't know if it's going to be a direct question, but I would definitely want to get across, like, things are really hard, but I've made it work. Right. To me, that's like a really important thing to get across to an interviewer right now.
And I think don't be complaining at all about what your law school has done, even if you disagree with it strongly. This is, as we often say, like, this is a good time to put like a positive spin on whatever it is that you're upset about. And if you're very upset about it, you need to talk to someone about it so it doesn't come out in the interview.
Yes, complain to your friends about the fact that you were going to get straight A's in the spring.
Right.
And they took away your
C
grades.
Pluses, but they just took that away from you. No one believes you. Don't even mention it.
Please. That's the number one topic I'm concerned that students are going to bring up.
Yeah. And I think, it is possible that someone might aggressively ask you about these things. And again, I think you just want to be prepared and not defensive about it. And if they're like, well, why did you take pass-fail classes your second semester? It's like, well, because that's what the school required,
Yes.
Or if they didn't require it, you need to have an answer for why you decided to do that. But I think bringing these things up preemptively and defensively is not going to help you at all.
Absolutely. And please don't say that you knew you were going to get X grade.
Yeah.
But it was pass fail. You do not know that. There's no way to prove that. Someone cannot tell you that was going to happen. And so, everything was pass fail, and that's fair given the circumstances, and, move on.
Yeah, it was totally out of your control anyway. I mean, if your professor specifically came to you and said, this is the best exam I've ever seen and you can document that, okay, fine. But even then, I still think you probably shouldn't bring it up because it just makes you look a little weird.
It's risky. I've just heard this seems like the number one topic that's going to come up. So it's something I'd be prepared to talk about.
Right. And I think, again, just put the most positive spin possible. How are virtual classes going? No one actually really cares about your answer. I mean, A, they're probably just making conversation, and B, they kind of want to see how you respond. So, if it's like, oh, it's like such a hassle, like I hate it, that's not a good answer. Like, oh, there's some challenges, but like I'm using virtual office hours and I think so far it's going pretty well. Whatever.
Yeah, think of a positive. Even if you're not positive about it, like think of something you can say that's like positive or an improvement or whatever it is.
Yeah. And I don't think you have to be Pollyanna-ish. It's not like, oh, it's so amazing, everyone's doing great. You need to be kind of realistic but positive, I think, is the takeaway here. All right, well, we are out of time. Any final thoughts on this?
My final thought is that I know this is going to be really different than how it would have been normally, but I really genuinely think that there are advantages to it. And so I would just focus on that.
Yeah, and there's nothing you can do about it anyway. So just kind of roll with it, do your best, and make sure that your dog is not showing up on your webcam.
Good point.
And if they are, then hopefully it's a cute puppy and everyone will love it. All right. Well, with that, we're out of time. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. For more career help and the opportunity to work one-on-one with us, you can check out careerdicta.com. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We would really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to Lee or Allison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.